start. So I hope how many people most of the people were here last week, right? So, no, you were not. Okay. So my YouTube video that I took of the first lecture came out, and it is on YouTube. So you can just search for it on YouTube. Search my name, Saul Weinreb, and try Talmudic medicine, and you'll probably find it.
Okay, on YouTube.
Yeah. So, but in the first lecture last week, we discussed medicine in the time of the Talmud, basically in the time of the Gemara, and we talked then about the influence of Greek and Roman medicine on Chazal. We talked about the influence of Persian medicine on Chazal and the influence of Babylonian medicine on Chazal. So this lecture, we're going to move up a little bit in history and talk about the post-Chazal period and talk about Jewish physicians from the time of the Gaonim, time after the Gemara, the time of the Byzantine period into the Arab period, and into the late Middle Ages. We're going to go up to the time we'll touch on Spain a little bit, but I'm not going to concentrate on Spain a lot because I'm saving a whole lecture for the Jewish doctors of Spain, which will be the next lecture. So the title of this lecture is Building Bridges: How Jewish Doctors Brought Greek and Roman Medicine to the Byzantines and the Arabs, and Arab medicine to Europe. So this is, I kind of hinted at the end of last week's lecture as to what this was going to be about. But we're going to start focusing, and for the most part, the way I'm going to design this lecture is I'm going to pick specific physicians throughout those time periods and show how they were able to be the bridge that brought ancient medicine forward. And really, if you think about it, the Jewish people were like uniquely situated to be the ones that disseminated both commerce, in terms of business, and knowledge from one place in one side of the world to the other place in the other side of the world. They had natural people in each place that they could talk to in common languages because the Jews were scattered everywhere and they always were able to talk to their brethren. And if you were a Jew from Babylon or from Palestine or Turkey or wherever, and you went by ship to Spain or North Africa or Italy or whatever, you can talk to the people there, and they spoke the local language, and you spoke the local language from back there, and they were, for the most part, much better educated than most of the masses of the time. So the Jews were like the natural people to bring that transition. So the first doctor that I'm going to focus on is someone his name was Asaf Harofe. Asaf. Many people are familiar with his name because a big hospital just outside of Tel Aviv is named after him, called Asaf Harofe Medical Center. So if you say Asaf Harofe, people think about the hospital, the modern hospital, but it's actually named after this particular physician. Asaf Harofe was a Jewish physician that lived somewhere, we don't know exactly where, but somewhere Syria/Iraq, somewhere or Babylon, whatever you want to call it, somewhere around the 4th century or so. And he wrote, we don't know a lot about his life as a person, but we know a lot about what he wrote, because he wrote a book called Sefer Asaf Harofe, which was the first Jewish medical textbook ever written that we're aware of. And it was one of the most important medical textbooks written in that time. Because what he did was, and for those that were here the first lecture would remember, at that time, Chazal had kind of been influenced by Greek and Roman medicine, Persian medicine, Babylonian medicine, and Chazal added a lot of their own thoughts. So Asaf Harofe, as a Jewish physician, basically took Greek and Roman medicine, because it's very heavily Roman and Greek influenced. All the theories of the humors, we mentioned the 4 humors, a lot of the humorist philosophy of medicine, which was Galen's philosophy. And he wrote it in Hebrew, but took a lot of the Talmudic terms and applied Talmudic terms and Hebrew terms to anatomy and to medicine in general. And that became one of the standard textbooks. It was eventually, it was quoted by numerous of the Rishonim that we're familiar of. It's quoted by Rav Hai Gaon, it was quoted by the Rashi, the Ramban, the Aruch, and some of them call it occasionally Sefer HaRafuot. But they're generally referring to the Sefer Asaf Harofe. So it had a tremendous amount of influence in the Jewish world and the general world around it. Some of the things that are fascinating about it, it did have one of the earliest known, other than the Hippocratic Oath, one of the earliest known oaths for physicians becoming a doctor. and it's over 1,000 words long, and in it is a lot of modern ideas about ethics and practicing medicine ethically. It was it's quoted in a lot of the early Arabic writings. Rajas, and one thing you're gonna have to excuse me is my pronunciations are going to be bad, because a lot of these terms that I'm going to mention names are Arabic names or French names or Spanish names, and please, if I mispronounce something, please forgive me right now. So Rajas, who was one of the famous Persian/Muslim physicians, one of the most influential Arab physicians, actually Persian physicians in history, quoted several times Sefer Asafarofe. So you see how that Sefer was able to be a resource for the early Arabic doctors, and he was bringing the Greek and Roman medicine into the next centuries. So that was one physician. Then, as the Byzantine period came to a close, and the Arab conquests and the Islamic conquests of most of the Middle East took place, so that began the age of Arab medicine and the Arab golden age of the science of the early Arab times. So it turns out that many of those early Arab scientists learned their science from Jewish teachers. Several famous ones that are well known, and this is recognized in the Arabic literature as well. This isn't just a self-serving Jewish literature, but if you think about it, as they conquered these areas, where were they going to learn from? So those were the natural people to learn from. So there was a Jewish physician named Masar Juwai of Basra in Iraq, who translated in the 7th century, took many old medical words, translated them into Arabic, so the local Arabs can read them. There was another really famous one. His name was Rabban al-Tabari, who was a Jewish physician who eventually converted to Islam. He was actually the teacher of the Arab physician Rajas, who anyone familiar with medical history would know that name as one of the most famous Arab physicians in history. And there's another one, Isaac Israeli, who was probably another one of the most important Jewish physicians in history, also known as Isaac Judaeus. He also famous for taking the Arabic medicine and bringing it into Europe. He was a contemporary of Rabbeinu Saadia Gaon, quoted by Rabbi Saadia Gaon. In approximately the year 904, he was nominated to be the court physician to one of the Arab princes. He eventually settled in Tunisia, in Kairouan, where he studied medicine under one of the Jewish physicians there. When he was in Kairouan, he taught. He had two Talmidim, one Islamic Talmud whose name was Abu Ja'far ibn al-Jazar, also very famous, and Dunash ibn Tamim, who is a famous Jewish scholar. He wrote a Pirush on the Sefer Yetzirah, mostly dealing with astrology and astronomy, who was also a student of Isaac Israeli. A couple of things that he was famous for, he was the first person to describe a tracheotomy, and he also wrote about 10 to 15 medical works, which became some of the foundation works in Europe for hundreds of years later. Isaac Israeli was one of the famous ones. And he was one of the ones responsible for taking Arab medicine, putting it in Hebrew so that it can be disseminated into Europe, and he was famous for that as well. Another person that quoted him significantly was the Ibn Ezra. They did correspond. So that's another example. As the Arab period comes to a close, there's just a couple examples of Jewish doctors that helped take the Greek Roman medicine and translate it into Arabic. Then as the Arabic period started coming to a close and the centers of science and learning started moving into Italy, into Spain, into southern France, it was again Jewish physicians that took the Arabic works and translated them into the local languages, or translated them into Latin, or translated them into French, or translated them into Spanish, and so on. And especially, or translate them into Hebrew, which was able to be a language that can be transferred because there's going to be Jewish scholars there. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, and actually in Franco-Germany, this as early as 880, the personal physician to Louis the Pious in Franco-Germany, one of the kings was the first known Jewish doctor in Germany. His name was Tidkia. So I'm going to focus a little bit on a couple of interesting stories. So, some of the early medical schools, yes?
I'm just curious about this Sefer Asaf
Right.
You wrote it in Hebrew. Did anybody translate it?
Some of it has never been published. Some of it is. You can find it in Hebrew. It was published in like the 1800s. It's not. No one's published it recently, but there's manuscripts available of most of it.
Was he writing it just for the Jewish physicians? I mean, who was he besides the Arabs? Who else was he read it?
Mostly the Jews. His students. They're actually named. It was written. Most of it was actually transcribed by his students, and the people that he taught were mostly Jews, and he wrote it in Hebrew. They say that the style of writing is very similar to the style in the Medrash, and because it was almost contemporaneous with that. It was really just barely after the time of the Gemara when he lived. So, and he was in the time when the academies of Sura and Pumbedita were still ongoing. So, but it's interesting because that's when the Greco-Roman medicine really entered the Jewish framework. Because when you read the Rishonim, they do quote the humorist philosophy of medicine all the time, the four humors and the four Yisodos. Anyone that reads the Rishon thinks that that's a Jewish idea, but it's not. It's a Greek-Roman idea. It's not mentioned in Shas at all, but the Sefer Asaf Arofa is one of the first places where it enters the Jewish lexicon and becomes a Jewish idea. But a lot of Jewish traditions translate into Hebrew because that's the language that they learned it in, that's the language that they were teaching it in, and that was a language that someone can take the manuscript to a country halfway across the known world, and someone else could read it there, right?
Jewish.
Right. Somebody else that's Jewish. And the Jews were learning and teaching in schools with non-Jews as well. So I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Their influence was on the world of medicine, not just on the Jews. And this is really the point of tonight's talk. So there was a medical school. It's often called the first medical school, but it's really not true. If you were here last week, you'd know that the first medical school was really in Persia. But in Salerno in Italy, in southern Italy, often it's called, the first medical school is the Salerno Medical School. Well, what's interesting is that for several hundred years, from about, the 9th century or so, or actually the 10th century until about the 12th to 13th century, the most prominent center of medical learning in the world was in Salerno, Italy. Well, it happens that the founder, or one of the primary founders of the medical school of Salerno, was a Jewish physician, and his name was Shabtai Danilo. I'm going to tell you a little bit about his life in a minute. But this medical school is famous for a lot of reasons, but one of them is that their philosophy was to take all of what they considered then the main streams or the main bodies of scientific knowledge and combine them. So, and those were the Greek / Roman knowledge, and Christian and Jewish and Arab, right? Which those are considered the main four bodies of knowledge that they had. So there's a legend that they used to say in the school that it was started by four masters: a Jewish Hellenist, a Greek Pontus, an Arab Adela, and a Latin Salernus. These were the four founders of the school. They were kind of legendary figures. In actuality, one of the main founders was Shabtai Danilo. Shabtai Danilo was born somewhere around the year 913 or so, and he was born in a city in Italy called Oria. He had a hard childhood. He was captured by an Arab band that had apparently invaded somehow Italy or something, and he was taken captive for a while until finally his family found him and they ransomed him. But the family ended up being chased out, and he was stuck in Italy. He had an interesting, hard life, but he turned to medicine and astrology, and he spent his life studying medicine. And he's one of the earliest known Jewish writers on medicine. He wrote a medical work called Sefer HaYakar, and he also wrote a Pirush to Sefer Yetzirah, which deals with astronomy, astrology. It's interesting, some of his works, I don't know if some may be familiar with the popular Sefer that people learn in Musar called Orchot Tzadikim. And it's anonymous, no one knows who wrote it. But there are portions of Orchot Tzadikim which are word for word from Shabtai Danilo's writings, where he writes about how the human body is like a microcosm for the world, and he uses that to teach ethical lessons. And Orchot Tzadikim literally almost verbatim quotes him. So, but no one knows who the author of Orchot Tzadikim was, but whoever he was, he obviously read Shabtai Danilo. So Shabtai Danilo established this medical school in Salerno, for several hundred years, there were many Jewish physicians that were involved in that school. And that school became where most of, we know that Ibn Ezra, when he wanted to print, Ibn Ezra was a doctor, and he came to Salerno to publish his writings. We know from, what's his name? The traveler, Tudela, Benjamin Tudela. So he also wrote about, how he found Jewish physicians at the medical school of Salerno when he visited Salerno on his travels. So that was a very prominent school, and the influence of the Jews that brought and translated Arabic works into Latin so that the Italians can read it was very significant, very important. So, after a couple hundred years, somewhere, and please forgive me if I'm off by a few years, but somewhere in the late 12th century, there was the invasion of Spain by the Almohads, which was a much more fundamentalist or fanatical Muslim group that came and took over most of Spain. And they were enforcing Islamic rule throughout Spain, and there was a lot of anti-Jewish persecution then. That was the time when the Rambam's family was chased out of Spain because they were running away from the Almohads. Again, please forgive me if I'm not pronouncing things correctly. But at that time, there was many Jewish physicians in Spain, but a lot of the Jews ran like the Rambam's family did. They ran south into North Africa, but more than that, went north into southern France. So southern France became a center of Jewish medicine and medicine in general. And this is a pattern that we find throughout history in general, that when persecution chases Jews out of some place, then all the physicians and scientists, and many of whom are Jews, get chased out. It's to the loss of the place that persecuted them and to the gain of the place where they went. And most famously, we all know this is happening in Nazi Germany and the brain drain that they caused by sending all the Jewish scientists out of Germany. Famous Einstein and so on and so forth. But this happened then too. And the Jews that went to southern France went to set up two medical schools. The first one I'm going to talk about is in Montpellier, right? and I might be butchering the pronunciation. But Montpellier became, after Salerno, the most prominent medical school in Europe, and lasted for several hundred years. It became the center of medicine. Till today, there's marble plaques in the University of Montpellier that commemorate the founding of the school, and there's people illustrated in those plaques that are obviously being shown to be Jews in the plaques that founded the school. Nonetheless, the Jews still suffered from a significant amount of persecution. And we're going to talk about this in another lecture in this series about the decrees that were placed by the church against Jewish physicians specifically. But a little bit, we'll touch upon it today, because the Jews were restricted. They weren't allowed to treat Christians. But nonetheless, they did, because the Christians would go to the Jewish doctors because they wanted to, because most of the doctors were Jews, or because they had a much better reputation. And the church was constantly, over the centuries, making decree after decree after decree, trying to tell the Christians that you're not allowed to go to the Jewish doctors. And the punishments were getting more and more and more severe, and the punishments on the Jewish physicians for treating Christians were more and more and more severe. But nonetheless, the practice persisted. It persisted to the extent that the richer and more powerful you were as a Christian, the more easy it would be for you to get away with having a Jewish doctor. So despite the decrees against the Jewish doctors, the Christian noblemen and princes and kings and so on would have their own Jewish doctors. In fact, the popes themselves, and this will be a subject of an entire lecture, the Pope's Jewish doctors, which is a fascinating topic, that a significant number, possibly the overwhelming majority of popes throughout the centuries, had their own private Jewish physician, at the same time that they were passing laws, literally putting anyone to death if a Christian would be treated by a Jew. It's one of the most fascinating, strange stories of history, which we'll get into, because I reserved an entire lecture for that topic. But just to say, so the Jews in Montpellier had to deal with this, but nonetheless, even after some of these decrees were promulgated, at one point, there was a Jew, the name of Yaakov ben Machir, who was from the Ibn Tibbon family, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about the Ibn Tibbon family in a few minutes. He actually became the dean of the medical school in Montpellier at a time when Jews weren't allowed to treat Christians. So it's kind of bizarre that these kinds of things were happening. But physicians often were given the rights to not wear the badge, because Jews had to wear a distinctive badge in many of these places, including in Montpellier. So they had certain things. But just to give you an idea, in Montpellier, at the writings of Averroes, where a famous Arab physician was translated by one of the Ibn Tibbon family. There was a doctor named Avram Shem Tov in Marseille, a same region in France, who translated numerous Arab medical works into Hebrew. There was a doctor named Moshe Farachi ben Shalem, who translated Rajas. That was the Persian physician we're talking about, translated from Arabic into French. So there was a lot of these issues. There was another medical school in Lunel, which was actually a Jewish medical school that was founded sometime in the 12th century, and that was founded almost to counter Montpellier, which was heavily Jewishly influenced, but it was against the Jews. So they made a Jewish medical school in Lunel, and I'm going to talk about that more in a second. But just to give you a couple of a sense for what it was like, you have these Jewish physicians that are prominent. They're treating the kings and the queens, and meanwhile they're subject to all this persecution. Just to get a sense for what it was like in Almohad, Spain, for a Jewish physician, there's a story that a famous story about a Jewish doctor named Rabbi Yitzchak Hamon, who lived in Granada. And the kingdom of Granada is a portion of southern Spain. It was, and when the Almohads came, so they take over the area, and Rabbi Yitzchak Hamon was the king's doctor. So one day, he would go every day to the royal court to tend to the king. That was his role. One day he was passing some Muslims who were arguing with each other. So he saw them fighting with each other, and he didn't want to get involved, so he turned around and started walking away. But as he started walking away, the commotion started to grow, and he couldn't get out of the way. There was people starting to gather. He was trying to get away, and one of the people in the crowd was trying to stop the fight. They was trying to break them up. So he yelled. He said, "By the life of the prophet, right? By the life of the prophet, let him go and stop fighting. Just stop the fight." But the guy didn't listen. He started beating. He continued punching him or whatever he was doing, right? And then he saw this person who was trying to break up the fight. He saw that the king's physician was standing in the crowd. This is a prominent person, the king's physician. So he says, look, the life of the king's physician is standing right here in front of him. You're going to fight like this? Stop fighting. So the Muslim looked. He saw there was the king's physician there. So, he said, okay, whatever. He let go, and he stopped, and he broke up the fight that way. So here you see the respect that people had for the king's physician, who was a Jew. And then the people in the crowd started to scream and yell. He said, look how the faith was just degraded. He said by the life of the prophet, and the guy didn't stop fighting. But he said by the life of the king's physician, who's a Jew, and he stopped fighting. So he stopped fighting because of a Jew, and he didn't stop fighting because of the prophet. So the entire crowd started getting all riled up, screaming and yelling about how their faith had been humiliated, and they took up swords, and it started a pogrom. There were hundreds of Jews killed that day because of what had happened, and it just after that, it says that all the physicians in Almohad controlled areas of Spain wouldn't ride horses anymore, would kind of always try to walk behind things, never try to be prominent. It's just a story to see the mix, how the kind of dichotomy of being both the king's physician but also being a Jew who's being persecuted. Another interesting story, which is a little bit later in history, but it kind of illustrates the same type of, dichotomy, the same type of contradictory feeling of being both the Jewish physician that's prominent, but on the other hand being persecuted. A little bit later, going to the middle of the 16th century, when Francis I, if I'm not mistaken, he's in France somewhere, but if my history is wrong, but I know for sure he was a king not in Spain, and he wanted a Jewish doctor. He had some kind of illness, and his doctors couldn't figure out what to do. So he sent a messenger to Spain, asking Charles V, who I guess was the king of Spain at the time, and he said, "I want the most skilled Jewish doctor in your kingdom. It has to be a Jewish doctor." So, of course, when the story comes to the Spanish king, this is after the expulsion of the Jews from Spain, they had a good laugh. They said, how are we going to find a Jew? We just threw out all the Jews a couple years ago. How are we going to find a Jew in our kingdom? So they said, we'll find one of the new Christians, one of these Jews who converted, who's a doctor. We'll send him there. It's good enough, because he's kind of like a Jew. So they sent a new Christian, or Marano or whatever, to France. Yeah, it was in France. So, and he presented himself as the Jewish doctor from Spain. Well, he's not allowed to be a Jew in Spain, but he's the Jewish doctor from Spain coming to France. So the king starts talking to him, and while he's talking, he, assuming that he's a Jew, he says, aren't you just tired of waiting around for the Messiah to come? I mean, you guys have been waiting for all this time. I mean, you must be tiring waiting for him. So the person said to him, what do you mean? I'm a Christian. So, the Messiah already came. So, and the king said right away, a Christian? I didn't want a Christian. He sends him back to Spain. He says, keep your Christian. I wanted a Jewish doctor. And the king of France he had to send to Turkey. And he got a Jewish doctor from Constantinople to come and treat him. But it's just one of these, another kind of a funny story about, there was another story where actually the brother of St. Louis, for those that don't know, St. Louis is King Louis, I don't know what number of France, who was a saint because he was so zealous for the church, which means that he persecuted the Jews terribly. He's responsible for the book burnings, which we say kinos about on Tisha B'Av, was St. Louis, who's the city was named after. But anyways, not such a saint. And he, his brother was Alphonse de Portier, so he had some kind of eye illness. He sent for a Jewish eye doctor from Aragon, from Spain, an area in Spain. The doctor wrote back letters trying to get out of coming, because by that point, the Jews had already been expelled from France. So here you had the king of France sending a letter to Spain trying to get a Jewish doctor from Spain. And the Jewish doctor in Spain is afraid to go to France because the Jews were thrown out of France, and he knows that St. Louis, Alphonse's brother, is not exactly the best friend of the Jews. In the end, he was actually forced to go, and he had to treat him, which he did. So just a couple other examples of people that I mentioned the Ibn Tibbon family. There was a Yehuda ben Shaul ibn Tibbon who was born in Grenada, chased out by the Almohads into Lunel, one of the founders of the medical school in Lunel. He translated several Arabic commentaries to Galen's works into Hebrew. He had a son, Shmuel ibn Tibbon, who was a doctor in Lunel also. There was another, Shlomo ben Yosef ibn Ayub Hasfardi, who translated numerous Arabic works into Hebrew and also wrote some works of his own. There was... the list kind of goes on and on and on for the Ibn Tibbon family, which is a famous family of doctors and translators. Just a little touch in a different area of the world, Portugal as well. There's a long lists of Jewish physicians in Portugal who treated also court physicians for the kings there. What's interesting about Portugal is a lot of the physicians were also astronomers and well educated in the sciences of the day. And two of those physicians, I think one was Joseph, and I cannot remember his last name, and the other one was Rodrigo or something like that. There were two physicians and astronomers who actually taught Vasco da Gama how to use his astrolabe to figure out his position based on the stars when he was in the water, so that he can navigate around, the Cape of Africa to circumnavigate Africa. So it was actually, there were two physicians in the king's court there who actually were responsible for doing that. That's just an interesting tidbit about Jewish doctors in Portugal. A couple other things that I wanted to touch on before we finished today. One was the women in Jewish medicine. There was a famous woman doctor who was, as far as I know, not Jewish, but interesting anyway, who studied in Salerno. I remember I mentioned in Italy, so we're talking the 10th or 11th century. She's very popular now among, women's groups today. They like to put her up on a pedestal as one of the earliest women who were involved in women's health and so on and so forth. Her name was Trotula of Salerno. Somewhere around the late 1000s, early 1100s. She was a woman who went to the medical school of Salerno, actually taught there, lectured there, and received a degree there and practiced as a physician. And she chose to practice obstetrics. As far as we know, she's the first physician in history ever to practice obstetrics, because until then, doctors didn't deal with that. That was only midwives. So she, as a woman, chose to make it into a medical field. And gynecology in general, she chose to make into a medical field, which obviously most male physicians, for the most part, ignored that as a discipline. So she wrote numerous works, which are to some extent of Jewish interest, because all of her works were translated into Hebrew and used by many Jewish scholars throughout the centuries in Europe. I forget what they were called, but they were called something like Trotula Minor and Trotula Major, or something like that a woman physician trained in Salerno, Italy at those days had written. There are several examples of Jewish female physicians at the time. One of the famous ones, I'm pretty sure it's in the Brooklyn Jewish Museum. They have a copy of, it may even be the original, of an agreement that was signed by a woman, Sarah de Saint Gilles, which is Marseille, France, not far from Montpellier. Where she studied there, we don't know. But she was a Jewish physician, and the agreement that they have in the museum there is of her contracting with a Christian male medical student to teach him. So, and the contract said that she provided him room and board, and he had to pay her whatever fees he collected from treating people as a medical student, because he would collect fees and give them to her as her thing. That was the terms of the contract that they had written up. But there are several other names of female Jewish physicians from this time period. So, just to summarize, what I wanted to accomplish today was to really look at a very, very broad period of history, but a period of history when specifically looking at medicine, the Greco-Roman philosophy of medicine, and then as that moved through the Arabic period with the famous Arabic physicians Averroes, Avicenna, and Rajas, and then taking those and bringing them into Europe, into the Middle Ages, were to a large extent done because of Jewish physicians. And the major medical schools were to a large extent also either founded by or heavily influenced by the Jewish physicians and their abilities in transmitting that knowledge. The next lecture, I'm going to focus on Spain. And there's a lot of very interesting material on Spain, and also for hundreds of years post-expulsion of Marano's Jewish doctors in Spain, which goes for a long time, well into the 18th century. There's Marano physicians practicing in Spain after generations of generations, and we'll talk about some really fascinating stories next time we meet. Next week, I'm not going to have a lecture. I'm going to be in Eretz Yisrael. I think the next 2 Tuesdays I'm going to be out. But look in the bulletin and it'll say. I'm going to be there for a little over a week. But then we'll pick up when I get back. Any questions or comments? No? All right. Well, thanks for coming.